Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video, I'll be doing a full build and review of the Hasegawa 1/72nd scale Brewster Buffalos that are part of the US Navy combo set. These were the first kits I've ever airbrushed, and I did them for Model Minute's Not-So-Stealthy Group build, using schemes that you guys voted on. So without further ado, let's have a build of these two kits. To begin with, I give all these sprues and my resin parts a wash in some warm soapy water to clean any oil or small debris off the parts which might prevent glue or paint from adhering to them. Once dry, I then cut out the fuselage halves and seat from the kit sprues using some side cutters, before then carefully removing any burring from the attachment points with a knife. Off camera, I primed all of my resin parts using some Vallejo white aerosol primer, and after cutting off the attachment points for the kit's cockpit, I used some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to glue the cockpit sidewall details to the interior, the kit's plastic seat to my resin floor, and to fix the control column into place. I also had to repair my resin rudder pedals, which I printed attached to the main instrument panel, but they're rather delicate and possibly underscale. In subsequent versions, I've upgraded the rudder pedals by making them a little bit larger. I accidentally damaged the internal framework I'd printed for the wheel well, so I had to repair that one. While the glue bonds all the resin parts, I moved on to adding the forward fuselage sections. The instructions say to add this part after the main sections have been joined together, but to make adding the internal framework easier, I decided to attach it to the fuselage half a bit earlier. I repeated these same steps to add the second Buffalo. The F2A2 has a slightly longer nose with a different exhaust setup, so the forward halves are slightly different. Once both Buffalos were at the same stage, I trimmed the landing gear framework down slightly so that it could fit inside of the nose compartment, and then I glued it into place. The interior of US Navy Buffalos were apparently done in an aluminium lacquer finish, so I used some X20A acrylic thinners to thin down some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium and brush painted the interior. I brush painted 2 coats of the flat aluminium, and then my airbrush finally arrived. I'd initially only brought Vallejo and AK acrylic thinners and cleaning products, since these are my favourite paints to use, so I switched over to Vallejo's Model Air 71062 aluminium and finished off the base of the flat aluminium with a light coat mixed with a ratio of 50% thinner to 50% paint. After the final coat had been airbrushed on, I then switched back to the hairy stick to paint the instrument panel and the finer sidewall details with Vallejo flat black. I paint some of the raised switches, engine controls, and the pump next to the seat with Vallejo model colour US Field Drab, and Vallejo Vermilion Red was then used for various switches on the sidewalls, control stick, and the main instrument panel. To highlight the raised gauge details and small switches, I added some Vallejo flat white onto a brush and then dabbed away most of the paint until I only had a tiny amount left, which I then dry brushed onto the main instrument panel. Once dry, I then fixed up the excess white on the main instrument panel by mixing some flat black with a small amount of water and letting it flow into the gaps between all of the gauges and details. Further details in the cockpit are painted using flat yellow, vermilion red, and for the piping around the cockpit floor I used Vallejo 70924 Russian uniform green. On one cockpit part I accidentally damaged this piping, so I ended up painting some jewellery making wire with the uniform green and then using it as a replacement. I neatened up any mistakes I made using the Model Air aluminium and a brush, and once that's dry I paint the cover at the base of the control column with saddle brown and glued the replacement wiring and forward landing gear bay parts into place. With the interior painted, I then applied some enamel-based Tamiya black panel liner scent over all of the interior and landing gear bay to help highlight the details by letting it flow into all of the gaps and around the bases of raised areas. To help it flow further and make it less dark on the raised areas, I then use a cotton bud dipped in enamel thinners to wipe away the excess and thin it down so that it flows more. Once the enamel wash is dried, I then glue the instrument panel and cockpit floor into each of the 2 Buffalo's fuselages. Being resin parts, they sometimes don't always fit perfectly, and I found the rudder pedals had to be slightly modified as they were too small by removing them from the instrument panel and gluing them to the cockpit floor. The sidewall details also slightly interfered with the cockpit floor or the fuel tank area, so I trimmed a bit of them away and then used that to help line it up, and the fit was pretty much perfect. The final touch before joining the fuselage halves together was to add a tiny dab of Vallejo gloss varnish onto all of the gauges to add a glass-like shine to their faces. I then applied some more of the Deluxe Materials odorless CA glue to the resin parts, and some Revell Contactor Professional Polycement to the plastic ones, and pushed the two fuselage halves together. I used some Tamiya masking tape and a bulldog clip to hold the parts together and tighten up the slight gap between some parts of the fuselage halves while the glues bonded. I set the fuselages aside and moved on to cutting out the two upper and lower wing halves for each aircraft and glued them together, clamping them with some bulldog clips. If I were to ever do this kit in this scheme again, I would leave the wings off along with the horizontal stabilizers to make painting easier, but in this case I cut out and cleaned up the horizontal stabilizers, rear tail pieces, and the smaller accessories such as the tail wheel and hook to attach them to the model. Once the tail hook area had been cleaned up of any flashing, I glued the small hook to the inside of the rear half, added the other side, and then attached it to the rear of the fuselages. The tail wheel followed, and after the attachments had been sanded of any flash, I glued the horizontal stabilizers to the back of each Buffalo. The Navy Buffaloes also have the life raft canister along with a headrest and some interior framework, which I cut out, assembled, and added to the rear part of the cockpit area with plans to paint them later on. These parts were rather tight and fiddly, and more so with the F2A1 didn't seem to quite fit too well with the rear window section, which I'd discover later on. By now the fuselage was pretty solid, so I removed the tape and glued on the wings. I had to trim down the attachment points on the wings slightly and also use some of the CA glue so that it would bond to the resin fuel tank, but even so the fit was still pretty solid, and after the two halves had been pushed into the fuselage with a bit of pressure, they stuck pretty well. Another component I should have probably left off until later was the landing gear, which consists of the main strut, a wheel, and landing gear cover. These parts were cut out, sanded, and then glued together. The landing gear looks solid enough, but there is a bit of a weak point where the wheels attach, which I managed to break once on the F2A2 later on, and damaged several times on the F2A1. The landing gear was also a bit tricky to align with the outer and inner attachment points inside of the wings and fuselage, but with a bit of fiddling I managed to get a tight and correct looking fit. Next I cut out the base pieces of the engine and glued them into place. I like the way the engine and prop assembles in this kit, since you can add the engine followed by the front cowling parts, and then add a spinning prop as part of an assembly later on. The front sections differ slightly on the F2A1 and F2A2, but are still quite similar. Notably, the longer F2A2 has an extra two panels on both the upper and lower surface, which had to be glued into place. With most of the assembly complete, I prepare the model for painting by applying some Vallejo water-based putty over any of the gaps and seam lines present, and then I use a damp finger to carefully wipe away the excess putty, leaving it only in the gaps. I leave the putty overnight to dry, and the next day I sand down the seam lines and excess putty using a sanding stick for nails, followed by some very fine sandpaper to get a nice smooth finish. I then fix any recessed details that were lost to either the sanding or putty by carefully using a pointed scriber to re-scribe them, or in the case of the rivets just to do a small dot. Somehow I managed to break the wing off of the F2A1 while scribing a bit around the exhausts, so I left that part off until I was finished scribing and then glued the wings back on. Unfortunately, both wheels were also damaged, and though I managed to glue everything back into place, they definitely weren't as strong as they used to be. The last details I added were some brake lines based on reference photos, which I made by cutting out some very fine jewellery wire, bending it to shape, and then gluing it to the base of the wheels. I also hoped this would add a tiny bit more strength to them, but these brake lines would also prove fragile and not very noticeable, and I think two of them even broke off at one point, so I decided to just leave them off. Before priming the model, I then used my airbrush to blow any particles of dust off of the models, and then I used some white tack to mask over the cockpit from both the underside window and the upper side canopy. To prime both of the models, I first add 12 drops of Vallejo's acrylic thinner and 22 drops of Vallejo gloss black primer to my airbrush, mix it with some backflow, and then begin to lightly spray over the upper surface of both models. I start with the wings and then move on to the fuselage, taking care to keep each coat nice and thin and trying to build the primer layer up slowly. I would aim for each pass to make the surface visibly wet, and once I'd built it up to a solid glossy black, I then repeated this process with the second Buffalo. The upper surface of the first Buffalo had about 15 minutes to dry as I painted the other aircraft, and then once it was done, I placed it upside down on the turntable and sprayed the first aircraft's underside in the same manner. Once the two Buffaloes are finished in gloss primer, I leave them to cure for 24 hours, and the next day move on to painting. Being brand new to airbrushing, it took a little bit of fiddling around until I got the ratios right for the paints I was using. Initially, I tried 3 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, 3 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Thinner, and 6 drops of Vallejo Model Air Aluminium for the base colour. However, I found this ratio didn't seem to come out of the airbrush very well, and after a bit more experimenting, I eventually ended up with a ratio of about 8 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, 20 drops of acrylic thinners, and 10 drops of Vallejo Model Air Aluminium. For my first attempt at aluminium, I decided to try and create a pre-shading kind of effect by applying the paint in the center of each panel section first, and then doing a unifying pass over the whole model to blend it in a bit. I ran out of paint at one point and refilled with 2 drops of Flow Improver, 14 drops of acrylic thinners, and 8 drops of aluminium, which worked really well. To move the model around, I try to hold on to the white tack area that was masking the interior sections, although I found the rotating base was very handy when I remembered that I had it. Once the upper surface of the first Buffalo was done, I then moved on to painting the upper surface of the second Buffalo, much as I'd done with the primer. As you can see, I was still getting the hang of finer controls and the right ratio, but I was quite happy with my first ever airbrushing. By the time I'd finished painting the aluminium on the upper surface of the second Buffalo, the paint was touch dry on the first one, so I held onto it while painting the underside and also tried out the turntable, which was very useful. Once the aluminium was applied on both of the Buffaloes, I gave the paint a few hours to cure, and then got out some masking tape to cover over the bare aluminium areas near the wing, cowling, and the tail. As well as this being my first attempt with airbrushing, I'd also not really used masking tape for paint very often. I found it a little bit of a tedious process to apply it, especially considering all the areas on the Buffalo that were really small and hard to cover, and I found that its curvy shape and tight spaces around the tail were quite difficult to mask. For narrow sections of the aircraft and to create a precise edge, I used 3mm tape, and then for the larger areas I filled it in using a mixture of 9 and 16mm masking tape. I decided to also try out some chipping fluid on these builds, so once both of the planes were masked, I mixed 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners and 4 drops of Vallejo chipping medium, and then applied it over the areas which I hadn't masked. I probably applied it too quick and thick, however, as I did see it pool slightly in some places, so in the future if I ever use it again, I may thin it further and apply it slower, because as you'll see I had a lot of issues later on. I gave the chipping fluid a full 12 hours to properly dry, and then to create some pre-shading and the F2A2's black cowling, I mixed 4 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 5 drops of acrylic thinners, and 3 drops of Vallejo Model Color Flat Black. I then carefully filled all the panel lines on the F2A2 before then building up a few layers for the engine cowling. I then repeated the process of pre-shading the F2A1's panel lines, and did a final spray of black on the F2A2's cowling. Unfortunately, I didn't hit record while I was painting the first few layers of the wings, but I used 2 drops of Flow Improver, 8 drops of thinners, 19 drops of Vallejo Model Air RLM04 Yellow, and 1 drop of Vallejo Model Color Vermilion Red. This ratio was based on Hasegawa's painting guide, and I feel like it produced a pretty good colour, although it was very slow to build up, so I did have to do quite a lot of passes to build it up until it was no longer showing as much of the pre-shading and the silver colour. Both Brewsters had yellow wings, and the F2A2 also had a yellow tail and horizontal stabilizers. Once the yellow on both planes was solid and dried, I painted Thach's F2A1's white tail using 4 drops of a Vallejo Flow Improver, 3 drops of the acrylic thinners, and 3 drops of Vallejo Model Color Flat White. The white airbrushed very smoothly, and it didn't seem to take too many layers to produce a nice finish. While I had it out, I also decided to spray some white on the upper surface of both of the cowlings to add a bit of a faded and lighter shade of paint on the upper surface. Once dry, I then sprayed the F2A2's tailband and cowling with the flat black using the same ratio as I'd done previously, and for Thach's green I went with 3 drops of Flow Improver, 4 drops of thinner, and 3 drops of Vallejo Model Color 70833 German Camouflage Bright Green. This turned out to be a perfect match for the kit's green decals, although I probably applied it a little bit too thin. I also had considerable overspray with this paint on the wings and tail, which I would have to fix up later on. After all the painting was completed, I then removed all of the masking tape. Although not perfect, I was still pretty excited with the results. I would need to fix up the green overspray and the tail markings for both aircraft, but first I decided to try out the chipping fluid, and this is where things went kind of disastrous. I started out just using a cocktail stick dipped in a tiny bit of water, and found I could make okay scratches on the leading edges of the wings, if maybe a little bit large, but when I then tried to add some around the walkway and panels on the upper surface, I found that the upper layers of yellow started to full on peel away and come off in massive chunks. I had success with the cowling though by using a fine brush dipped in water and a very small needle. I really liked that I could very gently use the needle on the cowling access hatches and around the rivets to make very fine scratches, as though various tools had scratched the paint away as maintenance had been performed. Though the needle worked okay on some parts of the wings, in other areas it would still strip large chunks away. I tried to soften these chunks with a brush, but found it didn't really work either. As you can see, the cowling on Thach's Buffalo worked out quite nice, but it too suffered from peeling very badly on the wings. So I'm not quite sure what could have caused this. I did leave at least 12 hours between applying paint and the chipping and scratching. Perhaps I did the paint or chipping fluid a little bit too thick, but either way I would have to mask the aircraft up again and gradually build up the yellow on the wings, which took a lot of layers. The result's pretty bad, but better than all of the stripped metal. I did consider fully stripping the kits back and restarting, but I'd spent so long already on them, plus I was fast approaching a deadline for the group build, so I decided to just accept the rather dodgy yellow paint on the wings with its various imperfections and layers visible and take it as a bit of a warning for future builds. The tailband markings were fortunately a lot easier to fix. I simply added more accurate masking tape lines and with a little bit more care added the paint. Not as good as if I'd gotten them right the first time, but they were acceptable. Although I did find out later I really should have measured the decals so that I could have an accurate width for the band, because it turns out I did mine a little bit too thick. Finally, I masked everything but the tail on Thach's Buffalo and fixed up the green overspray and peeling white paint, and with that the aircraft were fully painted. Safe to say I'm not happy with the chipping fluid on the wings, but the cowling looks good, and I'm sure it's my fault rather than a bad product, as many people seem to have a lot of success with the Vallejo chipping fluid. To seal the paint job, stop any more chipping disasters from occurring, and to prep the models for decals, I mixed 3 parts Vallejo Flow Improver with 6 parts acrylic thinner and 12 parts Vallejo gloss varnish into the airbrush, and sprayed over both of the entire aircraft in several light passes. I have to say, the ability to smoothly apply varnishes is something I'm very excited to be able to finally do with the airbrush, and I was really proud of how glossy and shiny the aluminium on the Buffaloes looked. I then gave the varnish 12 hours to dry before moving on to the decals. For the decals, I first cut out the ones from the rather large sheet that I would be needing, which was mainly the roundels, the numbers, common stencils, and a couple of the wing markings. Once cut out, I stuck the decals in some very warm water for just under a minute, and then placed them on some paper towel to absorb the excess water, and began to slide them off of the paper onto the model using a brush or my finger. I also find it helps to apply a bit of water with a brush to the area before applying the decal. The decals in this kit were pretty thick and rather fragile, unfortunately, and I had a lot of trouble with the wing decals. Not only did they not seem to quite line up, but they also had to be placed on a rather rough surface due to the chipping problems, and most problematically, there are some bulges on the outside of the wing which they're supposed to conform to. And although maybe cartograph decals would have managed, these did not. I continued to apply all the decals with no further issues, and once in place, I then used a cotton bud to apply some Vallejo decal softener onto all of the decals, especially the ones on the wings, followed by some Tamiya decal adhesive to help them soften and stick to the surface details. I then repeated this process for the F2A2, which pretty much had the same markings and the same issues with the wing decals. I then waited 12 hours for the decals to settle onto the model, and in the meantime added on smaller parts such as the pitot tube, and assembled the aircraft's propellers, which consist of 3 blades, a hub, and a spinner. I'm not really a fan of how they've done the 3 blades separate, as they're rather tricky to line up on the hub, and I don't see why they couldn't have bothered to mould them as a single piece. Once assembled, the gearbox is slid onto the shaft of the hub, and then a polycap can be attached to secure them into place. The F2A2 also has 2 separate pieces for the exhausts, which I add on. The gearbox can be glued to the engine cowling, although I decided to keep the prop assembly separate to make painting easier. The propellers are similar, although the F2A1 has smaller blades with a much smaller spinner, as well as a tall mast for the radio, which I had to attach. Once attached, I painted the pitot tubes and any parts of the landing gear that got oversprayed by accident with some Vallejo Air aluminium, and I also painted the propellers with this same colour. The wing decals unsurprisingly bubbled up and stuck out over some of the bulges, so I had to use a cotton bud to purposely break up any of the rough parts. I then used a fine brush to paint over the damaged areas of the wing decals using Vallejo Flat Black. I also painted both aircraft's tyres carefully and the blades of their props using this colour. While the black dried, I picked out the gearbox on the propeller assembly using Vallejo Model Air Medium Sea Grey for both aircraft. To fix the damaged green markings on Thach's Buffalo, I got out the German camouflage bright green, and as I mentioned, this colour seems to exactly match the decal to the point where I could barely tell where the paint and decal started. Although I did try and apply a light coat over all of the green strip to blend it together in case there was any subtle difference between the two, I mainly applied it on the areas where the green decal had failed. I added a few more coats of these various colours to neaten things up and make them nice and uniform, and then I got out some X31 Titan Gold and applied it onto the exhausts of both kits and the wiring details of the engines using some X20A acrylic thinners to thin down the paints. With all the painting done and decals added, I mixed up 2 parts of Vallejo Flow Improver with 3 parts Vallejo acrylic thinner and 6 parts Vallejo semi-gloss varnish and sprayed it in light passes over the entire of both aircraft. This varnish would help to protect everything from the weathering, while also giving a semi-gloss finish to the Buffaloes, which is how they would have been done. Although sadly the metal would not be as glossy as it had been, it still had a really nice shine with a little bit more of an accurate dullness to the real aircraft. While I gave the varnish 12 hours to cure, I painted the front surface of Thach's F2A1's prop with Vallejo Model Air aluminium and did some final touch-ups with the model colour flat black. There are decals included for the rather colourful blade tips, as well as the blade manufacturers, which interestingly are different for the 2 types of aircraft. I had no trouble with the logos, but I found that the tip markings didn't really fit the shape and size of either of the blades, so I decided to paint them by hand instead. Once the logos were applied, I added a touch of Tamiya decal adhesive to help them stick, and painted the tips initially with 2 coats of Vallejo model colour flat yellow. Once dry, the far tips were then painted with vermilion red for the very edge, and Vallejo Model Air USN Sea Blue was used for the inner part. Once the varnish had cured, I then glued the props to the model, although I wish I'd left them off until last, as I managed to damage the F2A2's prop while handling the model later on. Since I wouldn't be doing any more airbrushing, I removed the white Thach masking from both aircraft's cockpits, and found that it pulled the seat out with it, so I would have to glue that back in place later on. Immediately though, I cut out the window parts, and found that my 3D printed gun sight was too large to fit the original kit's windows, so I had to carefully enlarge the holes on the front windshield. Any excess flash and pin marks were carefully removed from the clear parts before I then painted the glare shield and sight with flat black and began painting the canopy frames with a coat of aluminium. Unlike the Airfix Buffalo, the canopy framework is very subtle, which made it very hard to paint and later on clean up, so I admit I did make a bit of a messy result in the end, but I did my best at the time. I plan to keep the weathering to a minimum as these interwar aircraft seem to be in pretty good shape in most of the limited photos of them. To start with though, I got out some Tamiya enamel based black panel wash and applied it around the engine and heavily onto the cylinder details themselves, the edges of the control surfaces, and all of the panel lines on the underside of the wings and some of the random ones on the fuselage. Later I would also apply it fully onto all of the panel lines on the upper surface of the wings. Once applied, I then used a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to soften the effect, help it flow more into the gaps, and by dragging it in the direction air would flow over the aircraft, helped to create some grime and streak effects. As you can see, I decided to do the effect on the yellow side of the F2A2's wing, and later did the same for Thach's F2A1. Once the first coat of aluminium had dried on the canopy frames, I then used a cocktail stick to try and carefully remove the excess paint from the windows, but as I mentioned, the framework was only done using some thin raised lines rather than proper raised ones on other kits, so it was really hard to carefully scratch it out. I decided in the end to add a second coat of aluminium and repeat the process to try and make it a bit neater. Once the enamel wash was dry, I then got out my Tamiya water-based weathering powders and applied the rust pigments heavily onto the exhausts of both aircraft. In reference pictures, Buffalo seem to have a noticeable amount of leaks and streaks around the engine, which is unsurprising as radials often leak oil even when properly maintained, and the exhaust streaks also seem quite prominent on the underside, and even in some photos seem to darken the wheel hubs, which makes sense as they would have been exposed to the exhausts in their retracted position. To recreate the oil grime, I use the black pigment and a very fine brush, and apply quite thin lines and quite watered down ones around the cowling. For the exhausts, I apply the black in more of a dabbing motion, streaking it backwards a little bit, and making sure that I use a thicker amount of pigments to get a darker effect. Before the pigments fully dry, I then reactivate them using some water, and streak them backwards using the fine brush around the cowling. This allowed me to soften the effect until it was nice and subtle. For any large areas I wanted to clean up, I would use a damp cotton bud. These techniques were then repeated on the second Buffalo, with the only difference being the exhausts are slightly lower, but the air still seems to flow it out over the wheels. Once the aluminium was dry, I glued the rear canopy and underside windows into place. It was while doing this that I somehow damaged the prop and left wheel of the F2A2. I managed to glue the wheel back on, but couldn't really fix the prop, so I ended up putting it back on with some blue tack so that I could still move it as required for animations. Although with a bit of force, the lower window went into place and fit snugly, the rear canopy sections on both aircraft needed a lot more pressure to fit with the framework and life raft. While the rear windows bonded, I test fitted the other canopy parts and brush painted some semi-gloss varnish onto the propellers to protect their decals and give them the same finish as the rest of the aircraft. I then sanded the front of each windshield down and carefully glued them into place. I found using a tiny drop of Revell Contactor Professional seemed to work better for the plastic, while the gun sight was glued to the window using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to prevent any fogging up. After some final touch-ups with the black on the gun sights, tyres and exhausts, I got out some Vallejo Model Colour English Uniform Brown and painted the headrests. For the main and nav lights, I used some Vallejo Model Air RLM01 Silver to carefully paint them in place. This would act as a base for the nav lights and be the main colour of the landing lights. I also used this to paint the end of the pitot tube. When the props were dry, I added some metal chipping by dry brushing a tiny amount of the Vallejo Model Air aluminium, although I found this technique easier with the Tamiya paints. RLM01 was once again used to add a tiny speck for the glass in the gun sights, and then I carefully painted the left side nav lights using Tamiya Clear Red, and the right side ones with some clear green using a very fine brush. After painting the lights, the last thing to do was add the rigging. I used some AK Interactive mega thin wire to carefully add the two rigging lines to Thach's F2A1, leading from the tail to the large mast in front of the cockpit, and a second line that leads from the left side of the fuselage to the tail. I dab a tiny bit of regular superglue, fix down one end of the rigging, then reel it out and place it onto the area where I want to add the next section, and once the other end is glued, I then cut the excess from the reel. I couldn't find exact references for the F2A2, but seeing as some of them seemed to have the wire leading from the tail to the wing, I decided to do both wings, and then add the same second smaller wire, which is a similar setup I've seen on some P40s. And once the rigging was done on the F2A2, my two US Navy Brewster Buffaloes from Hasegawa were finally completed. And here you can see the two finished models. It's safe to say that both of these kits are a tremendous leap forward for me, being the first I've ever done using an airbrush, and considering this, I think I got a pretty good result. Sure, the fuselage bands are slightly too wide, the masking is a bit messy in tighter places, and the chipping fluid turned into an absolute mess. I still think I managed to fix most of what I did wrong as I went, and I thoroughly enjoyed using the airbrush. It definitely produces much smoother results, and seems to be a bit quicker in terms of actually applying enough layers of paint at each phase. Plus, it's clear there are a lot of new techniques that I really look forward to messing around with, especially doing more pre and post shading as well as weathering effects when appropriate. I may still try the chipping fluid again in the future, although I'm a little cautious after how bad it messed up the wings. Definitely open to any advice in the comments for avoiding the paint peeling rather than chipping. I would also be curious to hear people's thoughts on the yellow colour. I was basically being a good citizen and following Hasegawa's instructions, and though it's not as pure yellow as I have seen in some illustrations, I have heard it was more of an orangey yellow in real life, and it turned out like this on my buffaloes, so I think it's reasonably accurate. Otherwise, I'm really happy with the overall finish with the more subtle weathering. I'm really glad how my 3D printed cockpit turned out. The shape of the instrument panel is a lot more accurate, and it's nice to see a glimpse of all the controls and the ribbing on the fuselage sides if you peer in. Despite a few tiny gaps and some rather thick and delicate decals, the Hasegawa kit seems to be quite good, and it's leaps and bounds ahead of the old Airfix one, though maybe not quite as detailed as the special hobby kits that I borrowed from a mate just to do an inbox comparison with. I really enjoyed building both these kits despite the mishaps on the way. I'm pleased with the final results, and I even got it done in time before the Not-So-Stealthy Group build deadline ended, so that's 3 wins for me, I think. And I'm very much tempted to potentially do some more Brewsters in some other schemes, especially the Finnish Air Force, which is one I may do in the future. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed seeing me do these builds. If you did, please be sure to leave a like. And if you have any questions or friendly advice to give me for future builds, please be sure to leave it down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support me making more build videos, inbox reviews, and doing some more stop motions, please consider subscribing and also becoming a patron member. Top tier patron members get early ad-free access to my videos, discounts on my cults page, and also occasional exclusive content. Next week, I'm planning to release 2 parts for a Airfix 190 build, which I'm planning to release in a similar format of doing 3 parts and then a full build like what I did with the Buffaloes. I'm also working on a short animation test, and I've got another War Thunder sketch that I'm currently starting to film, with plans to do a few more in the future, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise though, thanks again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.